The Marriage of Figaro, Ka 492, is an opera buffa in 4 acts composed in 1786 by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, with an Italian libretto written by Lorenzo Da Ponte based on a stage comedy by Pierre Beaumarchais, La Folle journée copyright La Mariage de Figaro. Origin: Beaumarchais's earlier play The Barber of Seville had already made a successful transition to opera in a version by Paisiello. Although Beaumarchais's Marriage of Figaro was at first banned in Vienna because of its licentiousness, Mozart's librettist managed to get official approval for an operatic version which eventually achieved great success. The opera was the first of 3 collaborations between Mozart and Da Ponte. Their later collaborations were Don Giovanni and Cosa fan tutte. It was Mozart who originally selected Beaumarchais's play and brought it to Da Ponte, who turned it into a libretto in 6 weeks, rewriting it in poetic Italian and removing all of the original's political references. In particular, Da Ponte replaced Figaro's climactic speech against inherited nobility with an equally angry aria against unfaithful wives. Contrary to the popular myth, the libretto was approved by the Emperor, Joseph II, before any music was written by Mozart. The Imperial Italian Opera Company paid Mozart 450 florins for the work. This was 3 times his yearly salary when he had worked as a court musician in Salzburg. Da Ponte was paid 200 florins. Performance history: Figaro premiered at the Burgtheater in Vienna on May 1, 1786, with a cast listed in the roles section below. Mozart himself directed the first 2 performances, conducting seated at the keyboard, the custom of the day. Later performances were conducted by Joseph Weigl. The first production was given 8 further performances, all in 1786. Although the total of 9 performances was nothing like the frequency of performance of Mozart's later success, The Magic Flute, which for months was performed roughly every other day, the premiere is generally judged to have been a success. The applause of the audience on the first night resulted in 5 numbers being encored, 7 on May 8. Joseph II, who, in addition to his empire, was in charge of the Burgtheater, was concerned by the length of the performance and directed his aide Count Rosenberg as follows. To prevent the excessive duration of operas, without however prejudicing the fame often sought by opera singers from the repetition of vocal pieces, I deem the enclosed notice to the public to be the most reasonable expedient. You will therefore cause some posters to this effect to be printed. The requested posters were printed up and posted in the Burgtheater in time for the 3rd performance on May 24. The newspaper Wiener Zeitung carried a review of the opera in its issue of July 11, 1786. It alludes to interference probably produced by paid hecklers, but praises the work warmly. Mozart's music was generally admired by connoisseurs already at the first performance, if I accept only those whose self-love and conceit will not allow them to find merit in anything not written by themselves. The public, however, did not really know on the first day where it stood. It heard many a bravo from unbiased connoisseurs, but obstreperous louts in the uppermost story exerted their hired lungs with all their might to deafen singers and audience alike with their street and PST. And consequently opinions were divided at the end of the piece. Apart from that, it is true that the first performance was none of the best, owing to the difficulties of the composition. But now, after several performances, one would be subscribing either to the cabal or to tastelessness if one were to maintain that Herr Mozart's music is anything but a masterpiece of art. It contains so many beauties, and such a wealth of ideas, as can be drawn only from the source of innate genius. The Hungarian poet Ferenc Kazinczy was in the audience for a May performance, and later remembered the powerful impression the work made on him. Nancy Starace, see below, the beautiful singer, enchanted eye, ear, and soul. Mozart directed the orchestra, playing his fortepiano. The joy which this music causes is so far removed from all sensuality that one cannot speak of it. Where could words be found that are worthy to describe such joy? Joseph Haydn appreciated the opera greatly, writing to a friend that he heard it in his dreams. In summer 1790 Haydn attempted to produce the work with his own company at Esterházy, but was prevented from doing so by the death of his patron, Nikolaus Esterházy. Other early performances: the emperor requested a special performance at his palace theatre in Luxembourg, which took place in June 1786. The opera was produced in Prague starting in December 1786 by the Pasquale Bondini Company. This production was a tremendous success. The newspaper Prageroburpastamsiitung called the work a masterpiece, and said no piece has ever caused such a sensation. Local music lovers paid for Mozart to visit Prague and hear the production. He listened on January 17, 1787, and conducted it himself on the 22nd. The success of the Prague production led to the commissioning of the next Mozart Da Ponte opera, Don Giovanni, premiered in Prague in 1787. See Mozart and Prague. The work was not performed in Vienna during 1787 or 1788, but starting in 1789 there was a revival production. For this occasion Mozart replaced both arias of Susanna with new compositions, better suited to the voice of Adriana Ferraris del Bene, who took the role. For Divani he wrote Aldisio di Cittadora Euro, Come and Fly to the Desire of, the One Who Adores You in July 1789, and for Venет, in Ginocchio Tavi he wrote Un moto di gioia a Euro, a joyous emotion, probably in mid-1790. Brahms's view: Johannes Brahms said, in my opinion, each number in Figaro is a miracle. It is totally beyond me how anyone could create anything so perfect. Nothing like it was ever done again, not even by Beethoven. Contemporary reputation: The Marriage of Figaro is now regarded as a cornerstone of the standard operatic repertoire, and it appears sixth on the Operaverse list of the most performed operas worldwide. Roles: the voice types which appear in this table are those listed in the original libretto. In modern performance practice, Cherubino is usually assigned to a mezzo-soprano, Count Almaviva to a baritone, and Figaro to a bass baritone. Synopsis: The Marriage of Figaro continues the plot of The Barber of Seville several years later, and recounts a single day of madness in the palace of Count Almaviva near Seville, Spain. Rosina is now the Countess. Dr. Bartolo is seeking revenge against Figaro for thwarting his plans to marry Rosina himself. And Count Almaviva has degenerated from the romantic youth of Barber into a scheming, bullying, skirt-chasing baritone. Having gratefully given Figaro a job as head of his servant staff, he is now persistently trying to obtain the favors of Figaro's bride-to-be, Susanna. He keeps finding excuses to delay the civil part of the wedding of his two servants, which is arranged for this very day. Figaro, Susanna, and the Countess conspire to embarrass the Count and expose his scheming. He responds by trying to compel Figaro legally to marry a woman old enough to be his mother, but it turns out at the last minute that she really is his mother. Through Figaro's and Susanna's clever manipulations, the Count's love for his Countess is finally restored. Place: Count Almaviva's estate, Aguas Frescas, 3 leagues outside Seville, Spain. Overture: the overture is in the key of D major. The tempo marking is presto. That is very fast. The work is well known and often played independently as a concert piece. Act 1. A partly furnished room, with a chair in the center. Figaro happily measures the space where the bridal bed will fit while Susanna tries on her wedding bonnet in front of a mirror. Figaro is quite pleased with their new room. Susanna far less so. She is bothered by its proximity to the Count's chambers. It seems he has been making advances toward her and plans on exercising his droit du seigneur, the purported feudal right of a lord to bed a servant girl on her wedding night before her husband can sleep with her. The Count had the right abolished when he married Rosina, but he now wants to reinstate it. Figaro is livid and plans to outwit the Count. Figaro departs, and Dr. Bartolo arrives with Marcellina, his old housekeeper. Marcellina has hired Bartolo as legal counsel, since Figaro had once promised to marry her if he should default on a loan she had made to him, and she intends to enforce that promise. Bartolo, still irked at Figaro for having facilitated the union of the Count and Rosina, promises, in comical lawyer speak, to help Marcellina. Bartolo departs, Susanna returns, and Marcellina and Susanna share an exchange of very politely delivered sarcastic insults. Susanna triumphs in the exchange by congratulating her rival on her impressive age. The older woman departs in a fury. Cherubino then arrives and, after describing his emerging infatuation with all women, particularly with his beautiful godmother the Countess, asks for Susanna's aid with the Count. It seems the Count is angry with Cherubino's amorous ways, having discovered him with the gardener's daughter, Barberina, and plans to punish him. Cherubino wants Susanna to ask the Countess to intercede on his behalf. When the Count appears, Cherubino hides behind a chair, not wanting to be seen alone with Susanna. The Count uses the opportunity of finding Susanna alone to step up his demands for favors from her, including financial inducements to sell herself to him. As Basilio, the slimy music teacher, arrives, the Count, not wanting to be caught alone with Susanna, hides behind the chair. Cherubino leaves that hiding place just in time, and jumps onto the chair while Susanna scrambles to cover him with a dress. When Basilio starts to gossip about Cherubino's obvious attraction to the Countess, the Count angrily leaps from his hiding place. He disparages the absent page's incessant flirting and describes how he caught him with Barberina under the kitchen table. As he lifts the dress from the chair to illustrate how he lifted the tablecloth to expose Cherubino, he finds the self-same Cherubino. The Count is furious, but is reminded that the page overheard the Count's advances on Susanna, something that the Count wants to keep from the Countess. The young man is ultimately saved from punishment by the entrance of the peasants of the Count's estate, a preemptive attempt by Figaro to commit the Count to a formal gesture symbolizing his promise that Susanna would enter into the marriage unsullied. The Count evades Figaro's plan by postponing the gesture. The Count says that he forgives Cherubino, but he dispatches him to his own regiment in Seville for army duty, effective immediately. Figaro gives Cherubino mocking advice about his new, harsh, military life from which all luxury, and especially women, will be totally excluded. Act 2, a handsome room with an alcove, a dressing room on the left, a door in the background and a window at the side. The Countess laments her husband's infidelity. Susanna comes in to prepare the Countess for the day. She responds to the Countess's questions by telling her that the Count is not trying to seduce her. He is merely offering her a monetary contract in return for her affection. Figaro enters and explains his plan to distract the Count with anonymous letters warning him of adulterers. He has already sent one to the Count that indicates that the Countess has a rendezvous of her own that evening. They hope that the Count will be too busy looking for imaginary adulterers to interfere with Figaro's and Susanna's wedding. Figaro additionally advises the Countess to keep Cherubino around. She should dress him up as a girl and lure the Count into an illicit rendezvous where he can be caught red-handed. Figaro leaves. Cherubino arrives, sent in by Figaro and eager to cooperate. Susanna urges him to sing the song he wrote for the Countess. After the song, the Countess, seeing Cherubino's military commission, notices that the Count was in such a hurry that he forgot to seal it with his signet ring. They proceed to attire Cherubino in women's clothes, and Susanna goes out to fetch a ribbon. While the Countess and Cherubino are waiting for Susanna to come back, they suddenly hear the Count arriving. Cherubino hides in the closet. The Count demands to be allowed into the room and the Countess reluctantly unlocks the door. The Count enters and hears a noise from the closet. He tries to open it, but it is locked. The Countess tells him it is only Susanna, trying on her wedding dress. At this moment, Susanna re-enters unobserved, quickly realizes what's going on, and hides behind a couch. The Count shouts for her to identify herself by her voice, but the Countess orders her to be silent. Furious and suspicious, the Count leaves, with the Countess, in search of tools to force the closet door open. As they leave, he locks all the bedroom doors to prevent the intruder from escaping. Cherubino and Susanna emerge from their hiding places, and Cherubino escapes by jumping through the window into the garden. Susanna then takes his place in the closet, vowing to make the Count look foolish. The Count and Countess return. The Countess, thinking herself trapped, desperately admits that Cherubino is hidden in the closet. The enraged Count draws his sword, promising to kill Cherubino on the spot, but when the door is opened, they both find to their astonishment only Susanna. The Count demands an explanation. The Countess tells him it is a practical joke, to test his trust in her. Shamed by his jealousy, the Count begs for forgiveness. When the Count presses about the anonymous letter, Susanna and the Countess reveal that the letter was written by Figaro, and then delivered through Basilio. Figaro then arrives and tries to start the wedding festivities, but the Count berates him with questions about the anonymous note. Just as the Count is starting to run out of questions, Antonio the gardener arrives, complaining that a man has jumped out of the window and broken his flower pots of carnations. The Count immediately realizes that the jumping fugitive was Cherubino, but Figaro claims it was he himself who jumped out the window, and claims to have injured his foot while landing. The three attempt to discredit Antonio as a chronic drunkard whose constant inebriation makes him unreliable and prone to fantasy, but Antonio brings forward a paper which, he says, was dropped by the escaping man. The Count orders Figaro to prove he was the jumper by identifying the paper. Figaro is at a loss, but Susanna and the Countess manage to signal the correct answers, and Figaro identifies the document. His victory is, however, short-lived. Marcellina, Bartolo, and Basilio enter, bringing charges against Figaro and demanding that he honor his contract to marry Marcellina. The Count happily postpones the wedding in order to investigate the charge. Act 3, a rich hall, with 2 thrones, prepared for the wedding ceremony. The Count mulls over the confusing situation. At the urging of the Countess, Susanna enters and gives a false promise to meet the Count later that night in the garden. As Susanna leaves, the Count overhears her telling Figaro that he has already won the case. Realizing that he is being tricked, he resolves to make Figaro pay by forcing him to marry Marcellina. Figaro's hearing follows, and the Count's judgment is that Figaro must marry Marcellina. Figaro argues that he cannot get married without his parents' permission, and that he does not know who his parents are, because he was stolen from them when he was a baby. The ensuing discussion reveals that Figaro is Raffaello, the long-lost illegitimate son of Bartolo and Marcellina. A touching scene of reconciliation occurs. During the celebrations, Susanna enters with a payment to release Figaro from his debt to Marcellina. Seeing Figaro and Marcellina in celebration together, Susanna mistakenly believes that Figaro now prefers Marcellina over her. She has a tantrum and slaps Figaro's face. Marcellina explains, and Susanna, realizing her mistake, joins the celebration. Bartolo, overcome with emotion, agrees to marry Marcellina that evening in a double wedding. All leave, and the Countess, alone, ponders the loss of her happiness. Susanna enters and updates her regarding the plan to trap the Count. The Countess dictates a love letter for Susanna to send to the Count, which suggests that he meet her that night, under the pines. The letter instructs the Count to return the pin which fastens the letter. A chorus of young peasants, among them Cherubino disguised as a girl, arrives to serenade the Countess. The Count arrives with Antonio and, discovering the page, is enraged. His anger is quickly dispelled by Barberina, who publicly recalls that he had once offered to give her anything she wants, and asks for Cherubino's hand in marriage. Thoroughly embarrassed, the Count allows Cherubino to stay. The act closes with the double wedding, during the course of which Susanna delivers her letter to the Count. Figaro watches the Count prick his finger on a pin, and laughs, unaware that the love note is from Susanna herself. As the curtain drops, the two newlywed couples rejoice. Act 4, the garden, with 2 pavilions. Night. Following the directions in the letter, the Count has sent the pin back to Susanna, giving it to Barberina. Unfortunately, Barberina has lost it. Figaro and Marcellina see Barberina, and Figaro asks her what she is doing. When he hears the pin is Susanna's, he is overcome with jealousy, especially as he recognizes the pin to be the one that fastened the letter to the Count. Thinking that Susanna is meeting the Count behind his back, Figaro complains to his mother, and swears to be avenged on the Count and Susanna, and on all unfaithful wives. Marcellina urges caution, but Figaro will not listen. Figaro rushes off, and Marcellina resolves to inform Susanna of Figaro's intentions. Marcellina sings of how the wild beasts get along with each other, but rational humans can't. Actuated by jealousy, Figaro tells Bartolo and Basilio to come to his aid when he gives the signal. Basilio comments on Figaro's foolishness and claims he was once as frivolous as Figaro was. He tells a tale of how he was given common sense by Donna Flemma, and ever since he has been aware of the wiles of women. They exit, leaving Figaro alone. Figaro muses on the inconstancy of women. Susanna and the Countess arrive, each dressed in the other's clothes. Marcellina is with them, having informed Susanna of Figaro's suspicions and plans. After they discuss the plan, Marcellina and the Countess leave, and Susanna teases Figaro by singing a love song to her beloved within Figaro's hearing. Figaro is hiding behind a bush and, thinking the song is for the Count, becomes increasingly jealous. The Countess arrives in Susanna's dress. Cherubino shows up and starts teasing Susanna, endangering the plan. Fortunately, the Count gets rid of him by striking out in the dark. His punch actually ends up hitting Figaro, but the point is made and Cherubino runs off. The Count now begins making earnest love to Susanna, and gives her a jeweled ring. They go off stage together, where the Countess dodges him, hiding in the dark. On stage, meanwhile, the real Susanna enters, wearing the Countess' clothes. Figaro mistakes her for the Countess, and starts to tell her of the Count's intentions, but he suddenly recognizes his bride in disguise. He plays along with the joke by pretending to be in love with my lady, and inviting her to make love right then and there. Susanna, fooled, loses her temper and slaps him many times. Figaro finally lets on that he has recognized Susanna's voice, and they make peace, resolving to conclude the comedy together. The Count, unable to find Susanna, enters frustrated. Figaro gets his attention by loudly declaring his love for the Countess. The enraged Count calls for his people and for weapons. His servant is seducing his wife. Bartolo, Basilio and Antonio enter with torches as, one by one, the Count drags out Cherubino, Barberina, Marcellina and the Countess from behind the pavilion. All beg him to forgive Figaro and the Countess, but he loudly refuses, repeating no at the top of his voice, until finally the real Countess re-enters and reveals her true identity. The Count, seeing the ring he had given her, realizes that the supposed Susanna he was trying to seduce was actually his wife. Ashamed and remorseful, he kneels and pleads for forgiveness himself. The Countess, more kind than he, forgives her husband and all are contented. The opera ends in a night-long celebration. Instrumentation. The Marriage of Figaro is scored for 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, timpani, and strings. The recitativi are accompanied by a keyboard instrument, usually a fortepiano or a harpsichord, often joined by a cello. The instrumentation of the recitativi is not given in the score, so it is up to the conductor and the performers. A typical performance usually lasts around 3 hours. Frequently omitted numbers, 2 arias from Act 4 are usually omitted, one in which Marcellina regrets that people abuse their mates, and one in which Don Basilio tells how he saved himself from several dangers in his youth, by using the skin of an ass for shelter and camouflage. Musical style. In spite of all the sorrow, anxiety, and anger the characters experience, only one number is in a minor key, Barberina's brief aria Lo Perduta at the beginning of Act 4, where she mourns the loss of the pin and worries about what her master will say when she fails to deliver it, is written in F minor. Other than this, the entire opera is set in major keys except the opening few bars of the duet between Susanna and the Count at the beginning of Act 3 which are in the key of A minor. The duet then quickly modulates via C major to A major. Mozart uses the sound of 2 horns playing together to represent cuckoldry, in the Act 4 aria Aprite un po' Quigliacchi. Verdi later used the same device in Ford's aria in Falstaff. Critical discussion. Lorenzo da Ponte wrote a preface to the first published version of the libretto, in which he boldly claimed that he and Mozart had created a new form of music drama. In spite of every effort. To be brief, the opera will not be one of the shortest to have appeared on our stage, for which we hope sufficient excuse will be found in the variety of threads from which the action of this play, that is Beaumarchais's, is woven, the vastness and grandeur of the same, the multiplicity of the musical numbers that had to be made in order not to leave the actors too long unemployed, to diminish the vexation and monotony of long recitatives, and to express with varied colors the various emotions that occur, but above all in our desire to offer, as it were, a new kind of spectacle to a public of so refined a taste and understanding. Charles Rosen proposes to take Da Ponte's words quite seriously, noting the richness of the ensemble writing, which carries forward the action in a far more dramatic way than recitatives would. Rosen also suggests that the musical language of the classical style was adapted by Mozart to convey the drama. Many sections of the opera musically resemble sonata form. By movement through a sequence of keys, they build up and resolve musical tension, providing a natural musical reflection of the drama. As Rosen writes, the synthesis of accelerating complexity and symmetrical resolution which was at the heart of Mozart's style enabled him to find a musical equivalent for the great stage works which were his dramatic models. The Marriage of Figaro in Mozart's version is the dramatic equal, and in many respects the superior, of Beaumarchais's work. This is demonstrated in the closing numbers of all four acts. As the drama escalates, Mozart eschews recitative altogether and opts for increasingly sophisticated writing, bringing his characters on stage, reveling in a complex weave of solo and ensemble singing in multiple combinations, and climaxing in 7 and 8 voice tutti for Acts 2 and 4. Other uses of the melodies: a musical phrase from the trio at the end of Act 2 of The Marriage of Figaro where Basilio sings Cosa fan tutte la belle was later reused in the overture to Cosa fan tutte. Figaro's aria non pieta to the first André is quoted in the second act of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, and is also used as a military march. Mozart recycled the music of the Agnus Dei of his Cra paragraph Nunc Messe for the Countess dove Sonno, in C major instead of the original F major. The same motif was used in his early bassoon concerto. Franz Liszt quoted the opera in his Fantasy on themes from Mozart's Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. In 1819, Henry A. Bishop wrote an adaptation of the opera in English, translating from Beaumarchais's play and reusing some of Mozart's music, while adding some of his own. In his 1991 opera, The Ghosts of Versailles, which includes elements of Beaumarchais's third Figaro play and in which the main characters of The Marriage of Figaro also appear, John Corigliano quotes Mozart's opera, especially the overture, several times. Recordings. See also: List of operas by Mozart, references, notes. Sources: Chanin, Michael. From Handel to Hendrix, The Composer and the Public Sphere. Verso. ISBN 1-85984-706-4, Deutsch, Otto Erich. Mozart, A Documentary Biography. Stanford University Press. Guringer, Karl. Irene Guringer. Haydn, A Creative Life in Music. University of California Press. XI, 403. ISBN A0-520-04316-2. Gutman, Robert W. Mozart, A Cultural Biography. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. ISBN 0-15-600-1171-9, Jackson, Roland John. Performance Practice, A Dictionary Guide for Musicians. Routledge. ISBN 0-415-94139-3, Janda, Owen. Stein, J.B. Forbes, Elizabeth. Harris, Ellen T. and Waldman, Gerald. Baritone, and mezzo-soprano, mezzo, in Stanley Sadie and John Tyrrell, The New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, 2nd edition. Macmillan. ISBN 0-333-60800-3. Landon, H. C. Robbins. David Wynne Jones. Haydn, His Life and Music. Indiana University Press. ISBN A978-0-253-37265-9. Malitz, Leo. The Opera Goer's Complete Guide translated by Richard Sanger. Dodd, Mead and Company. Rice, John A. Antonio Salieri and Viennese Opera. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Robinson, Paul. Opera and Ideas, From Mozart to Strauss. Cornell University Press. ISBN 0-8014-9428-1, Rosen, Charles. The Classical Style, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. New York, W. W. Norton and Company. ISBN A0-393-31712-9. Singer, Marshall and Singer, et. An Interpretive Guide to Operatic Arias, a Handbook for Singers, Coaches, Teachers, and Students. Penn State Press. ISBN 0-271-02354-6, external links, La Nozze di Figaro, Score and Critical Report in the name Mozart or Scabi, Complete Libretto, Full Orchestral Score, English Translation, Italian-English Side-by-Side Translation, The Marriage of Figaro, Free Scores at the International Music Score Library Project, Complete Recording at Mozart Archive, Teaching Material and Analysis from the Metropolitan Opera, Mozart's house in Vienna where he composed The Marriage of Figaro, photos of 21st-century productions of The Marriage of Figaro in Germany and Switzerland.